fleets. Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Throughout her career, Battleship New Jersey served as the flagship of 2nd, 3rd, 5th, and 7th fleets. In our other videos, we often talk about various U.S. Navy fleets. And so in this video, we're going to talk about what they are, where they are, what their responsibilities are, and where they have moved over their existence. So first of all, we are focusing at fleets. Fleet is the largest designation under the actual U.S. Navy. So U.S. Navy's up here, then above that would be the entire U.S. military, I suppose. So Navy, and then you've got a series of fleets, up to 12 of them, although it's not 12 right now. And then from there, you would go down to squadrons and task forces and other individual units. So New Jersey often served as the flagship of a task force or a battleship division or a squadron of ships. But we're specifically talking about that largest entity, the fleet. So in the U.S. Navy parlance, since World War II, it tends to be 7th Fleet, for example. 7th Fleet is one of the Pacific fleets. And then if you are in a task force in 7th Fleet, that task force may be Task Force 77. And if you are in a division in that task force, it might be 77.5. So individual units get more numbers as they get more narrowed down. But again, we're just talking about the fleets. Right now, in 2021, as we film this video, there are 7 active fleets. There are up to 12 numbers which have been historically used for fleets, and we're going to go through them all in a minute. But first, let's talk a little bit about the historical fleet designations. During the Age of Sail, and right up through World War I, fleets tended to be called where they were located. So the North Atlantic Squadron, or the African Squadron, or the Mediterranean Squadron. These are all fleets that were maintained throughout much of this country's early history. In the post-World War I years, the U.S. Navy started to name their fleets based on what they were. The Panama Canal meant that a single fleet of ships could very rapidly transit from one ocean to another. And Alfred Thayer Mahan's theories put forth in The Influence of Sea Power upon History hypothesized that keeping your fleet together in one single large combat force that could overwhelm an enemy's fleet was the best course of action. And so the U.S. Navy was divided into 3 main fleets. The Asiatic Squadron patrolled around the American colonies of the Philippines. This was usually a small cruiser and destroyer force with some submarines that was just for showing the flag, hardly the size of the other fleets. And interestingly, it retains the old sailing ship days name where you call it where it is located. This fleet is destroyed at the beginning of World War II, and that term is never used again. The rest of the fleet was divided into the battle force and the scouting force. So typically, the battle force is all of your battleships that form your line of battle, and your scouting force is more of the scouting cruisers and destroyers that are going to go out and find the enemy fleet. This isn't always the case. At different times, battleships were in the scouting force, cruisers were almost always in the battle force, and these two forces, as they participated in war games, the so-called fleet problems of the interwar years, would have their numbers adjusted to be more or less even for individual scenarios that were being played out. Right before the United States entered World War II, we switched to the Two-Ocean Navy Act, so there was an Atlantic Fleet and a Pacific Fleet. And then 1943, the U.S. Navy goes to this number designation, and most of the original 12 fleets are numbered at this time. And most of those fleets do not exist too long into the post-war years, and then they're almost all deleted, and then they're gradually brought back into the different areas of responsibility that are more or less what we have today. So we're going to go through the fleets that exist today, and then we'll talk a little bit about the ones that previously existed and no longer do. So first off, the fleets are numbered even if they're on the East Coast and odd if they're on the West Coast, or I should say to the west of the United States and to the east of the United States. And they're not numbered in ascending order. The U.S. hates to use the number 1 for anything because it implies that, hey, maybe we only have one of that thing. So the numbers are kind of all over the place, and that is intentional. The U.S. always takes just weird numbers for different divisions and regiments and things like that, and they're not necessarily in ascending order. Part of this is because they're reactivating historic units that have been brought into and out of service over time, and part of it is to obscure the exact number of fleets or divisions or regiments or squadrons that we actually have in our military. So even though there are currently 7 fleets active, the numbers range from 2 to 10. So let's go off of the East fleets first. So number 2 is homeported in Norfolk, Virginia, 2nd Fleet, and they are responsible for the North Atlantic, the Arctic, and the continental United States. 2nd Fleet is one of the fleets that New Jersey was the flagship of in the mid-50s. She broke the flag of Admiral Charles Wellborn when 2nd Fleet was NATO's striking force in the Atlantic. So that area of operation hasn't changed too much. 4th Fleet currently serves in the South Atlantic and is homeported in Mayport, Florida. 6th Fleet serves in Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Black Sea, and is homeported in Naples, Italy. 6th Fleet is traditionally known as the Mediterranean Fleet. So those are the 3 Eastern fleets. Let's go over to the 3 Western fleets. 3rd Fleet is responsible for the Eastern Pacific and is homeported in San Diego. 5th Fleet is relatively recently brought back, and they just operate in the Middle East. So they've got one of the smallest but most active areas of operation. They're homeported in Bahrain. New Jersey was also flagship of both 3rd and 5th Fleet during World War II. At that time, 3rd Fleet and 5th Fleet both referred to the same ships, known collectively as the Big Blue Fleet, but the fleet number varied based on who was in command of it. So when Admiral Halsey commanded the Big Blue Fleet, his 3rd Fleet staff turned them into 3rd Fleet. When Admiral Spruance commanded the Big Blue Fleet, his 5th Fleet staff turned them into 5th Fleet. So New Jersey operated in both, even though it was the same group of ships. And when they would swap out, say New Jersey is in Task Force 57.3 under Spruance, that task force just becomes 37.3 as soon as Halsey's flag is broken. So those 2 fleets were both traditionally in the Pacific, and they still are. 7th Fleet is currently responsible for the Western Pacific, and they're homeported in Yokosuka, Japan. During World War II, 7th Fleet was primarily under Admiral Kinkaid, and they served in the South Pacific alongside MacArthur's army, and then rejoined 3rd/5th Fleet during the Battle of the Philippines, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines invasion. And then that fleet was more or less just left in the Western Pacific, and eventually post-war was homeported in Japan. And because since the 1850s, the U.S. has had an interest in the Western Pacific, we have base ships there, usually the Asiatic Squadron, but then post-World War II, 7th Fleet. And this fleet is far more combat effective than the Asiatic Squadron ever was. They were just showing the flag. 7th Fleet is often made up of at least one aircraft carrier and their strike groups, amphibious warships, and other things that can rapidly project power in that part of the world. Finally, we have 10th Fleet. 10th Fleet has never really been a fleet of ships at all. 10th Fleet is currently, since 2010, U.S. Cyber Command. So it is the Navy's IT people, the Navy's computer defense group. During World War II, 10th Fleet was originally designed to help coordinate anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic. So again, 10th Fleet didn't have ships, it just had a fleet admiral staff, and they worked with the British and the Americans and any other allies to coordinate anti-submarine warfare efforts, and they're just diverting other fleets' assets to go and hunt down these U-boats. So 10th Fleet is a weird one. So this brings us to our inactive fleets. First up, we have First Fleet. The immediate past Secretary of the Navy, Kenneth Brightwaite, mentioned that he wanted to reactivate First Fleet as an Indian Ocean fleet, homeported probably in Diego Garcia, but not necessarily. It's unclear if, now that we have a new Secretary of the Navy, if this is going to take place or not. But 7th Fleet does have a very large area of operations with the entire Western Pacific, and not just is it large, but it's very active. And 5th Fleet in the Middle East has a small area of operations that can extend outside of that. But the Indian Ocean is becoming increasingly active because of piracy in both the Straits of Malacca and around the Horn of Africa. So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary to reactivate that force. First Fleet existed from 1947 to 1973 and was operating in the Pacific during that time. Nowadays, First Fleet colloquially, though not officially, refers to the U.S. Coast Guard. And there is an erroneous assumption that in time of war, when the Coast Guard is absorbed into the Department of the Navy, that they become First Fleet. And this simply isn't true, but I do like referring to the Coast Guard like that. They are the First Fleet. They were the first military vessels that the United States ever operated. 8th Fleet was responsible for Northwest Africa in the Atlantic. They only existed from 1943 to 1947, and so the fleet that attacks French North Africa during World War II is 8th Fleet. And shortly after the war, that fleet dissolves and has never been brought back. We already have a South Atlantic force, and having a fleet off African waters, it doesn't make sense if we've got a fleet that's responsible for the South Atlantic and another fleet that's responsible for the Indian Ocean and another fleet in the Mediterranean. So if someday the United States ever increases the number of fleets, and that's highly unlikely given the number of ships that we have, this fleet would probably be given a new area of responsibility. 9th Fleet and 11th Fleet are both World War II era potpourri designations. 9th Fleet originally answered directly to Admiral King in the Atlantic, and then it went to the Pacific answering under Nimitz, and 11th Fleet was created. The ships that participated in the D-Day invasions were technically under 11th Fleet, but post-World War II, these fleets ceased to exist. And again, they take control of such small areas of operation that they'll likely never come back as such. And finally, the 12th Fleet is also responsible for Europe, or was, but its area of responsibilities has since been taken over by 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean. Which fleet do you think is most important today? Let us know in the comment section down below. I'm really interested. In my opinion, 7th Fleet has been the most important since World War II. They have almost constantly been at war because of American interests in the Far East. Like I said earlier, we only kept one of the sailing ship era squadrons, the Asiatic Squadron, because we thought it was important enough to deploy there. Then 7th Fleet is retained in the Western Pacific, is primarily in charge during the Korean War when New Jersey is flagship of 7th Fleet, is primarily in charge of the Vietnam War, and now is still there with China being the closest thing to a peer adversary with their Navy, with their growing Navy right now. Maybe you disagree. 2nd Fleet was very important in the North Atlantic for much of the Cold War, and Russia is certainly resurgent as well. Maybe the fleets that operate closer to the United States are important, or maybe you think that actual fleet battles haven't happened since 1944, so Cyber Command, 10th Fleet, is the most important. Let us know what you think in the comment section. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and individuals. If you'd like to help support our museum and our YouTube channel, there's a link in the description below for ways you can donate. We really appreciate it. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find out about our museum. Thanks for watching.